Hey Kerusso, this is Frank Bolling. I'm the minister at the Park Avenue Church of Christ in Memphis, Tennessee. And today I'm going to be talking to you about Philippians chapter 1, verses 27 through 30, which I've entitled Living as Citizens of Heaven. After you've read the passage multiple times, one of the questions you want to ask yourself when you're preaching is, how does my text fit in with the letter as a whole, or the book as a whole? And so one of the things that you'll notice about this section in particular is that it's a transition section in the book. You move from Paul talking about himself, his imprisonment and what he's going through, him struggling to go and be with God or to stay here and continue his work as a missionary. It transfers from him focusing on himself to him transitioning to focusing on what the Philippians are going through, their situation and their affairs. And it also moves from more of a narrative to commands about how Paul wants them to live. It's also got a strong connection to this theme that we've been talking about and cultivating of the mind of Christ, because as Paul begins these commands here and exhorts them, he exhorts them specifically about their behavior. He says, I want you to live as citizens worthy of the gospel of Christ. And so that mind of Christ controls how we live from day to day and how we conduct ourselves and how we behave. But it also makes a connection to our unity as Paul continues to try to stress the unity in this church and the fighting that's going on between Euodia and Syntyche and those around them. It encourages the people to stand firm in one spirit and strive together side by side. And so it connects to this mind of Christ and the way it controls us and calls us to live. But it also really fits with this underlying theme of citizenship, as Paul is writing to this group at Philippi, who was proud of their Roman citizenship. They were proud to have the rights and privileges that came with being a Roman citizen. But Paul reminds them later in chapter 3 that their citizenship is in heaven. And here, when he says, I want you to live a life worthy of the gospel, that word specifically, live, is not just that, but it's live as a citizen. Normally, when Paul talks about that, he'll talk about walking, as he does in Galatians 5:16. He'll use the metaphor of walking, but here he specifically goes to that idea of citizenship, and so that's how it fits in with that greater theme. Paul also, this passage has a flow to it. It's not just words on a page, but he's building an argument. So as we see the flow of this passage, we see that in verse 27, we have the command, the exhortation, live as worthy citizens. Then he gives the reasons for that whether I'm absent or present, I may hear, one, that you're standing firm in the Spirit, contending side by side for the faith of the gospel. And then he describes the circumstances, and the reason for this exhortation is that they're experiencing this intimidation by their adversaries, their opponents. And then he talks about what this means. He says, don't be frightened, because this is an omen or a sign of your salvation, but their destruction. And then he reminds them that this is coming from God. It's not something you need to be frightened about, but God is actually bringing this on. And then he provides a theological explanation of the suffering that they're experiencing, and that it's a grace given to those who believe, and that it's consistent with Paul's own struggle. When you're preaching a text, you want to really focus on, what is this text trying to say? In other words, what is the big idea that this text is trying to communicate? And so I think the subject that Paul is addressing here is, what does it mean to live a life worthy of the gospel? That's the command, live a life worthy of the gospel. But what does that mean? Well, I think as we go through this passage, we'll see that it means living a life worthy of the gospel all the time. It means living unified, and it means that we don't ever back down from living this life. And so Paul will, in verse 27, will say, live as citizens, is the way that I've translated. And I want to show you this real quick. This is going to pop up, and I want you to see. This is Philippians 1:27. It says, only let your manner of life. And as I scroll over life, you'll notice this pops up down at the bottom left-hand corner. And you'll see where it says life, and it has this G4176, and then it's got this Greek word, and then kind of what it's, how you say it in English, and it's politeuomai. And you'll notice it gives the definition to live, and specifically live as a citizen, because this word is constructed around a noun that we know, which is polis, which is the Greek word for city. It was where we get our word for politics. And so he specifically wants to narrow in and focus on live your life as a citizen, not as a worthy Roman, but specifically as worthy of the gospel of Christ. And so as we come back to here, what does it mean to be a citizen of a country? As we think about our own citizenship, what rights and privileges are we given? What is expected of us? And then what pride do we take in our country? Obviously, the Philippians were very proud of their Roman citizenship. It's something that Paul is addressing head on and wants to remind them our citizenship is ultimately in heaven. And so the question comes is, can our lives as citizens of our birth country come into conflict with our citizenship in heaven? And I think the answer is yes. One example from my life that kind of sticks out to me as I look back as I was preaching at Lads to Leaders convention when I was in high school, and the theme that year was God and country, and there was lots of sermons, lots of talks about how God is blessing the United States and all these different things, and how God is blessing our country so that we can be a blessing of the world. And on Saturday night, after all the awards were given, we all stood up and we sang God Bless America together. American flags were projected on the walls. There was red, white, and balloons hanging everywhere. It was this moment of great emotion as people were belting out this song, and their eyes were full of tears as they thought about God blessing their nation. And then the next morning, Sunday morning, the first day of the week, as we sang the song before we gathered around the table, there was no emotion. In fact, it was very quiet. It was very somber. And I remember that striking me as odd, that people were more moved by God blessing their country than God dying for the world. And I don't want to make a judgment on everybody, but it kind of paints a picture that there is the temptation to take our citizenship of an earthly place and hold it in a more valuable position than our citizenship in heaven. Paul talks about this and had encountered this in Acts chapter 16, especially in verse 21. He's just cast out this spirit from this young girl, and he's been thrown in jail. And they bring Paul before the magistrates of the city, and their charge against him is he's a Jew disturbing our city. They advocate customs which it is not lawful for us Romans to accept or practice. In a sense, they're saying what he's doing is not consistent with the way we live as citizens here of Philippi. And so he wants them to know that we've got to throw him in jail. We've got to put him away. And so he's reminding them, hey, I went through the same struggle where I was faced with the choice. Am I going to live as a citizen of heaven, or am I going to live as a citizen of Rome? And so he's making this point that he wants them to live as the citizen of heaven, worthy of the gospel. And so what does that look like? Well, it means that whether I'm absent or present, I hear that you're standing firm. And so the question comes is, how do we act in front of people who matter? When I was in high school, I ran track and cross country. And for practice, what we would do is we would run laps around the school. And there was times where we were away from the coaches, that they weren't watching us. We weren't under their careful, observant eye. And when they were watching us, we ran with the best form. We ran as fast as we could. We made an effort to do what we were supposed to. But the temptation came that when they weren't watching us, when we were on the other side of the school, that we could slack off. And there was that temptation there. And so how do our circumstances affect how we behave? And so living a life worthy of the gospel means that we live that way all the time, no matter who's watching and no matter what circumstances we're going through. Whether Paul's absent or present, he wants to hear that they're living this worthy life of the gospel. But not only that, he wants them to stand firm and strive together. He wants living a life worthy of the gospel means doing it together. You'll notice in verse 27 that he really stresses the one spirit and the one mind striving side by side, or contending side by side for the faith of the gospel. And that word striving comes from basically where we get our word athletics. I'm not saying the Greek word correctly there. And so it's this idea of coming together as a team for a common purpose. One of the images that comes to mind is the Roman phalanx here. I've got an example here where you've got the soldiers lined up in such a way that their shield is protecting not only them, but the person next to them. And they've got to count on their partners, because if there's a breach in between any one of these cracks, that the whole phalanx could fall together. And so when Paul is reminding them to strive side by side, standing in one spirit, standing firm, he's reminding them that a life worthy of the gospel is not a lone man objective, but it's something that we do together. Later, when he's talking to Euodia and Syntyche, he reminds them that at one point they were striving together, but now they've got a division amongst them, and it's not having a good impact on the body at Philippi. Then finally, he says, I want you to not be frightened in anything. The opponents are making life difficult for the Christians at Philippi, and they want to know how they're going to respond. And Paul, we remember how Paul was treated at Philippi, and we remember that his current situation now is that he's in prison. Those were two opportunities where he was thrown into prison, where he had the chance to be scared. But he used those opportunities as a moment to spread the gospel. He wasn't frightened, but responded in faith. And so we see that he ended up, there was an earthquake, and he was able to stay in there and convert the jailer and his family. And then now that he's in prison, in his current situation, that it hasn't stopped the gospel. He wasn't scared, because now he's had an opportunity to preach to the whole imperial guard. And so the word that Paul uses here when he talks about not being frightened, it's used in other places in Greek literature to refer to horses who were scared or frightened in battle. Plutarch, who was a contemporary of Paul, uses this word in a story of a Roman soldier who died in battle because his horse got scared. His horse was agitated and threw him to the ground and ended up stamping on him and killed him. And so Paul's instruction here is, don't be scared of what's going on around you, but trust in the Lord. And so living a life worthy of the gospel means we don't get scared and we don't back down from being faithful and proclaiming this message with all boldness. Notice he says that this is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. And it's been granted to you, and I'll bring your attention to that in a second. You should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake, engaged in the same conflict that you saw I had, and now hear that I still have. And so not being frightened, it's a sign. It's a sign to the Philippians, not only of their salvation, that God is being faithful. He said this would happen, and he's with them, and the word continues to spread. It's a confirmation of their salvation, but of the opponent's destruction. But it's not only that, it's a grace. I told you, it's been granted to those who believe. You know, it doesn't sound like something we want to be granted, but that word comes from kind of the root charis, or grace. Normally, when we think of grace, we think of a gift, unmerited favor, but we don't tend to think of that unmerited favor as being suffering. So he says, don't be frightened, because what you're going through is actually a grace. And then Paul reminds them, this is a common experience that I had, and you share it with me, and you saw how God was faithful to me. In Philippians 1:14 specifically says, and most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. They've seen what happened to Paul, and they've seen how God has been faithful to him. And so as we think about preaching this passage, we want to ask the question, what does it mean to live a life worthy of the gospel of Christ? Where are our primary allegiance to? Is it to Caesar? Is it to our citizenship here on earth, or is it ultimately to the Lord and our citizenship in heaven? And what does that mean? It means that we live this life without being frightened. We live it in unity with those around us, and we live it in such a way that no matter what circumstances we're going through, no matter whose eyes are upon us, we live a life worthy of the gospel. I hope this has been encouraging to you, and I hope that it helps you prepare your sermons on this passage. Hope you'll have a blessed day.